Welcome, everyone. My name is Maureen Martin, and I'm the Programs Continuum Coordinator for CAN-DO Multiple Sclerosis. Thank you for acting on the belief that you are more than your MS by attending tonight's webinar, Relationships and Communication with Dr. Rosalind Cobb. I'm going to start the webinar tonight by talking a little bit about CAN-DO MS. CAN-DO Multiple Sclerosis is an innovative provider of lifestyle empowerment programs for people with MS and their support partners. We are the start of a whole new way of thinking about and living with MS. A national nonprofit organization, we empower people to move beyond their MS by giving them the knowledge, skills, tools, and confidence to adopt healthy lifestyle behaviors, actively co-manage their disease, and live their best lives. My renowned programs have helped thousands of people with MS reclaim their dignity, control, and freedom, and transform their challenges into possibilities. CAN-DO MS recently launched our new website, www.mscando.org. And please visit our new website where you can register for upcoming webinars and listen to our archived webinars. Check out our upcoming CAN-DO MS Lifestyle Empowerment programs, share your CAN-DO promise, and learn ways you can contribute to or get involved with CAN-DO MS. A few housekeeping items before we get started. This presentation is being recorded and it will be archived on CAN-DO MS's website. You're more than welcome to view the presentation again. And if you miss one of our upcoming webinars, you can find the archived version on CAN-DO MS's website. To ensure good sound quality with no background noise, all of the participants are in listen-only mode for the live presentation. Although your phone lines are muted, you still have the capability to submit questions to Roz, and we encourage questions at any time. Feel free to type your questions using the chat feature, which is located on the left side of your computer screen. You should see a box on the left side of your screen that says chat. And to submit a question, type in a small box that says chat with presenter. Roz will address as many questions as time will allow at the end of her presentation. So the job of the live participant tonight is to, number one, submit your questions. Number two, complete the evaluation at the end of the webinar. And three, review the webinar schedule and register for the upcoming CAN-DO MS webinars. We would like to thank Novartis Pharmaceutical Company's. The CAN-DO MS webinar series is sponsored by an educational grant from Novartis Pharmaceutical Company. So we have a great speaker tonight to talk about relationships and communication. Dr. Rosalind Cobb is the Vice President of the Professional Resource Center at the National Multiple Sclerosis Society in New York City, developing and providing educational materials and consultation services for healthcare professionals. As a clinical psychologist in private practice, Dr. Cobb has provided individual and family therapy for people living with MS for more than 25 years. She is the author of National MS Society's Knowledge is Power series for individuals newly diagnosed with MS, senior author of Multiple Sclerosis for Dummies, and co-author with Nicholas LaRocca, PhD, of Multiple Sclerosis, Understanding the Cognitive Challenges. Dr. Cobb is also the editor of two books, Multiple Sclerosis, The Questions You Have and the Answers You Need, now in its 4th edition, and Multiple Sclerosis, A Guide for Families, also from Demos Medical Publishing. So before we get started tonight, let's do a quick survey to see who is on the webinar with us tonight. We just put a survey up on the screen, and it asks, are you a person living with MS, a support partner, a healthcare provider, or other? So we'll wait just a couple of seconds and let everyone get their answers submitted. All right, looks like everyone. So we have about 90% of the people on the webinar tonight is a person living with MS. About 12% is the support partner, about 3% healthcare professional, and the same for other. So that's a great group we have. And with that, I will turn it over to Roz.
Thank you, Maureen. It's very exciting for me to be here tonight talking about one of my favorite subjects. I'm sorry that I can't see all of you in person, but maybe I'll have an opportunity in an upcoming CAN-DO program to meet you all in person one day. So I'm here tonight to talk about some communication tips to help you with your important relationships. I just have to get the slide to move. There we go. So what we're going to talk about tonight, first of all, is what do we mean when we talk about a healthy relationship? You know, relationship is a word that gets used a lot in this day and age, and I think it's worth spending a little time just knowing what it is we mean when we talk about a healthy relationship. And then how might MS affect some of those most important relationships in your life? And what are ways that communication, healthy, good communication, can make those relationships more comfortable, more effective for you? We'll look at what some of the common challenges are to effective communication. And we'll look at, in particular, some tips and strategies that you can use to improve your communication. So we have a lot on the agenda for tonight. In my mind, a healthy relationship is made up of a few very, very important components, starting with effective communication. And it was interesting at a Can-Do program, which is the 5-day program that Can-Do MS offers. We had a participant a couple of years ago give us some feedback that said, you know, you talk a lot about communication and how we should be using good communication, but we need some tips on how to do that better. And their feedback actually helped us to add an important component to our 5-day programs, looking at how to improve communication in relationships. For me, effective communication means talking and listening. Sometimes we forget the listening part, talking and listening, recognizing when we're in agreement with the other person, but also acknowledging differences and being comfortable acknowledging differences and figuring out how to manage those. Healthy relationships also involve mutual respect. If we can't respect each other, it's hard to take the steps that we need to take to work on problems and make the relationship what we want it to be. We also have to trust in that relationship, that it's a safe place to share feelings and ideas and thoughts and be respected by that other person while we're sharing. Good relationships have some shared goals and expectations. Things that you work on together, whether it's at work or at home. You work on ways to collaborate effectively on the things that are important to you. And I think healthy relationships have some mutual concern. You have to be on the lookout for each other, have each other's best interests at heart as you proceed in your relationship. MS has the ability to challenge even the most comfortable, strong, and successful relationships. And part of the reason is that MS has a way of changing the rules. And these are some common things that people say when they're affected by MS in their relationships. I don't feel like myself anymore. A person who's living with a new chronic illness suddenly finds that he or she feels very different than before. Sometimes it's even hard to find the old self because so many things have changed as a result of the disease. Both members in a relationship, whether it's a couple or colleagues, might say, well, this isn't the way it was supposed to be. This isn't the relationship that we signed up for. Things have changed to get in the way. Somebody who's living or working with a person with MS might say, this isn't the person I thought I knew. Sometimes there are physical changes or mood changes or changes with the way a person thinks or remembers when he or she has MS that can make the experience for the other person different. Our roles are changing, sometimes even in very close partnerships that are built on expectations of what each person in the partnership is going to do has to change because maybe MS symptoms get in the way. So the partnership has to be reorganized, renegotiated because of changes in ability for the person with MS. Everything feels different now. Somehow that relationship just doesn't feel as comfortable or familiar or predictable as it felt before MS came along. So these are some significant ways that MS can challenge even long-standing relationships. And I think there are a few more challenges that are important to talk about. MS as a disease isn't easy to understand. There's a lot we don't know about it. It's very unpredictable from day to day or week to week. It's also very different from one person to another. So it's just not an easy disease to understand or talk about. And because of the symptoms of MS that can come or go, MS introduces a lot of unpredictability into day-to-day life. And whether it's a relationship at work or at home, people can sometimes begin to wonder, well, what can we count on from each other? We had this smooth partnership going on, but now we just don't quite know what to expect. And we don't know what we can count on in the days ahead. MS certainly strains resources, and usually when we talk about that, people think in terms of dollars, and certainly couples who are living with MS feel the financial impact and worry about what the impact of the disease is going to be over time. But I think there are lots of other resources that are strained as well, and these are resources that are important whether you're talking about your partnership at home with your spouse, or you're talking about your relationships with colleagues or your employer, and that is that MS strains time and energy. It takes longer to do things for a lot of people who are living with MS, and it saps energy. And so those become unpredictable variables over the course of the day because there's such a strain on those important resources. And MS can interfere with communication, and that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight. How does MS interfere with our ability to talk to one another in a comfortable way? So my personal bias here, which if you haven't already picked up, you will, is that being able to communicate effectively about all of these challenges and changes that MS brings is effective communication. Without that kind of communication, we can't begin to meet those challenges. The very first and probably biggest challenge to communication in MS is that so many of the MS symptoms are invisible. If you look at this long list of symptoms that MS can cause, there are really only a few that are very apparent to other people. Certainly problems with walking are easy to see. We can pick up on it when somebody is having some problems with balance or weakness or running out of energy. And we can see if somebody's having a lot of stiffness or spasticity in their legs. And we might be able to pick up on it if somebody's speech has changed, if their speech is a little slurred or slowed or sounds different than it used to. And we would be able to see it if somebody was experiencing some tremor and it wasn't as easy for them to pick things up or hold things as it used to be. But other than that, all of the symptoms on this list aren't visible to other people. And what that means is that what other people see when they look at a person who's living with MS is only the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole lot more going on. So what does that mean? What's the effect of that? There's a little bit of a time lag when I click on the next slide, so we just have to be patient. There we go. No? This one. So what happens when you as a person living with MS look great on the outside? You look the same as you've always looked. But inside, you're feeling totally overwhelmed with fatigue. You're just exhausted. Or you're experiencing a lot of pain. Maybe it could be pain in your legs or your arms, tingling or burning, or some shock-like sensations, or a tight, strong hug-like girdle feeling around your middle? Nobody else can see that, but you're very uncomfortable. Or what if you're worried about having a bladder accident? You're in the middle of a conversation with somebody and all of a sudden you think, oh my goodness, if I don't get to the bathroom right away, I'm going to have an accident. Or you're having trouble concentrating on what the other person is saying or remembering what you're supposed to remember for this other person. Or what if you're just feeling so depressed that you can't even think about what the other person's talking about? What happens in your communication when all of that is going on inside you and the other person can't see it? And what do you think it would be like if you were the other person? What would it be like to live with or work with somebody who looked exactly the same on the outside, but somehow seems more and more like a stranger, not like the person that you knew? Well, it means that if you're somebody who's living with MS, you're going to have to figure out how to make sense for yourself about how you look on the outside to other people while you're feeling very differently on the inside. You're going to have to somehow reconcile those differences and find a comfortable way to explain to others why what they see when they look at you isn't always what they get. And it could be your spouse or partner, your children, your friends, people at work. It'll be up to you to help them understand the difference. And when you hear, but you look so good, how does that feel? We know that that's such a challenge for people living with MS sometimes that we have a whole booklet written just about how to handle that message, because for lots of people with MS, that's a very uncomfortable thing to hear from people. Sometimes when people say that to you, but you look so good, it's meant as a compliment, and we all love to get compliments. And sometimes it's meant to reassure somebody, you, or themselves. Well, you look so good, so things can't be too bad, right? But sometimes that message is a little bit of a double-edged sword. Sometimes you get the feeling that the person's saying to you, you look so good. How come you're not doing what I expect you to be doing? How come you're not getting your work done on time? Or how come the house isn't as clean as it used to be? Or how come things are just different? So sometimes that message doesn't feel very good at all. Sorry, it's taken a long time for this slide to load. You have to decide how you want to respond. Not sure what to do here. Let's move on. There it is. Okay, so you may want to respond differently in different situations. You need to think about who that person is who's saying it to you and figure out what the situation is. Is it a work situation? Is it a situation with your spouse or partner that you know really, really well? You have to think about what you need that person to understand, because sometimes it may make a lot of difference to you that the person understands, and sometimes it may not make much difference at all. And you want to decide how much energy you want to put into educating that other person, because sometimes it's going to be worth a lot to you to put that energy in, and sometimes you're going to figure out that it's just not worth the time and energy to spend on it. So you might pick an option. Somebody says, gee, you look so good, and you just say, well, thanks. And that's it. You don't need to spend any more time on it than that. Or, I wish I felt as good as I look. Or, let me fill you in on what's really going on. Your option, whatever you choose as your response, is going to depend on how much time and energy you want to spend and what you want that person to know. If you're a family member, friend, or a colleague, it's going to be important for you to remember that a person who has no visible physical symptoms at all, who looks perfectly good on the outside, could possibly be feeling exhausted, extremely uncomfortable, maybe dealing with some significant cognitive challenges, or having trouble seeing, or having trouble with their mood, or dealing with bladder symptoms. You don't know what's going on inside. But you also need to remember that a person who's very physically impaired, has a lot of physical symptoms that you can see very clearly, might be very cognitively sharp, no problems with memory or attention, no mood issues, very highly productive in spite of those symptoms. So you can't jump to any conclusions when you meet a person with MS, or you're working with a person with MS, or loving a person with MS. You can't jump to any conclusions about what's going on inside that person. So the goal for all of you, no matter who you are, is to remember that silence is often misinterpreted as not caring. So if you don't understand what's going on, but you don't say anything, or you jump to conclusions without asking, that can be interpreted as not caring. So getting ready to think about how to talk about some of these different issues is really important. And here are just a few examples I want to show you of the ways in everyday life in which silence or not explaining what's going on can be very easily misunderstood. You never want to do fun stuff anymore. Maybe you're tired of me rather than just plain tired. This is a great example of what happens so often when people don't explain what's happening with their MS fatigue, because it's so easy for a partner to misinterpret it as a loss of interest, as not caring, as being just disinterested, disengaged. With friends, we really are loading slowly today. Here's one. I don't get it. Phoebe always used to like our trips to the mall. What's gotten into her lately? Here's one from work. What happened to my star performer? Don't you care about this job or the company anymore? So here's an employer or supervisor jumping to the conclusion that the person's lost interest in her job, when what's really going on is all of these symptoms that are getting in the way of her working effectively. Joe sure isn't pulling his weight around here anymore. I guess we'll have to do his work too. This can easily happen in a work situation where everybody's already very, very busy, overwhelmed with their own work, and suddenly they're worried that a colleague isn't trying anymore, isn't interested, is leaving the work for them to do. Okay, I've gotten a very helpful message that the slides are loading more quickly for you guys than they are for me, which is very reassuring because they're very slow for me. Why don't you want to play with me anymore? Maybe if you take a nap, you'll feel better. You know, sometimes we just don't have the energy to do things with kids, and particularly with young kids, it's important to explain what's going on because they can easily misinterpret it as you not being interested. So the bottom line is that invisible symptoms of MS can be very difficult for others to understand. They can be distracting for you, the person living with MS, because you're focused on them, on the symptoms, rather than on what's going on around you. Those invisible symptoms can drain you because they're taking your attention, they're making you uncomfortable, and they're debilitating. You know, they use your energy and wear you out. And I know that people are extremely discouraged by all of the symptoms that they're experiencing from time to time because they're so uncomfortable. So I gave you a lot of these there. And these are all the things that it's important to try and explain to others. And there's a question of what's the best way to share with family and friends who haven't really accepted your changes in communication and emotions, and just say you blame it all on MS. That's a great question, and we're actually going to get to that. There's some other barriers to communication besides invisible symptoms. I think life is very, very busy and complicated these days, and so there's frequently no good time or place in the course of a day to have a focused conversation with somebody that you really need to spend some time with. And so you need to try and make that time, create it, almost like making a date for communication. Lack of information is another barrier. There are so many things about MS that are difficult to talk about, and one of the reasons that we offer these webinars is to help you learn about various aspects of life with MS so that you can talk more comfortably about them. Can-Do MS, as well as the National MS Society and other MS organizations, produce web programs, brochures, and lots of web content to help you get information that you need so that you can talk more comfortably about it with one another. And often people have very different coping and communication styles, and this is particularly true within couples. You've got one person who wants to know everything about MS, go to an educational program or participate in a webinar like this, and the other partner is, feeling like, I've got enough MS in my life. I just don't want to spend any more time thinking or talking about it. These are very different coping styles. It's not that one is better than the other, but they're different. And so you need to acknowledge that you have different ways of dealing with these challenges. And usually in a couple, there's one person who's much more of a talker than the other, so it takes practice to have communication that allows both people to talk and listen in the style that's most comfortable for them. And as if there weren't enough barriers, here's a couple of more. I think that feelings are one of the biggest issues that get in the way. Sometimes it's just too scary to talk about some of the issues that MS raises. And sometimes when people are having trouble understanding what's going on with you, or particularly if they say you're blaming everything on MS, sometimes that's because the thought that all of those things could actually happen to someone they care about and love is too scary for them to think about. Scary not only because they're worried about you and your well-being, but scary for themselves. They worry about what it will mean for them if you are dealing with more and more symptoms of MS. So anxiety and also denial, just not wanting to believe that any of these problems could actually happen, are big conversation stoppers. They keep people from feeling comfortable about opening up about difficult topics. Sometimes, particularly within couples, protectiveness gets in the way. You've got a difficult subject to talk about. Maybe it has something to do with fear of the future, or you're worried about economic issues and what MS will do to the financial security of the family, or you're worried about who's going to take on some of those additional chores. It may be hard to talk about that because you don't want to hurt the other person's feelings, or you don't want to give them more to worry about than they already have to worry about. So rather than bring up something very important and talk about it, I'll just wait. I'm not going to talk about that. I don't want to make him or her feel even worse than they're already feeling. So that protectiveness gets in the way. Guilt is another thing that stops conversation. Sometimes people get angry about these changes in their lives, or resentful. about the changes in partnership or changes in the division of labor in the office. And then they feel guilty because, feeling angry about somebody who has a chronic illness doesn't feel nice. I can't say that I'm feeling angry or resentful. That makes me not a nice person. But that means that then some of those angry, resentful feelings just keep building up inside and they don't get expressed. Embarrassment is another feeling that gets in the way. There are some things about MS changes that are just hard to talk about. Sexual changes, bowel or bladder, some cognitive issues can be very embarrassing for people to talk about. And so they just go along without having important conversations that would help make those things more understandable. It's hard to problem solve around an issue if you can't really talk about it comfortably. Certainly cognitive issues can get in the way of good conversations. People who are easily distracted or have trouble remembering what's going on, or they're just processing information slowly so the conversation feels bogged down or slow. That can cause a lot of frustration for both people, and so the conversations don't happen. And certainly mood issues. If somebody is significantly depressed, which we know is very common in MS, sometimes it's hard to summon the emotional energy that you need to carry on that conversation. So I've given you a lot of barriers, and I want to spend time talking about how to overcome those. And I think, again, my bias is going to show, I think it sort of starts with good communication. And so we need to be very aware of all the different ways we communicate with each other, because it's a lot more than just our words. Certainly we communicate a lot with our speech and in our conversations, but we communicate just as much with the tone of voice we use, with the facial expressions. If you're saying something loving, but the expression on your face is angry or hostile or resentful or accusing, you're saying as much with that facial expression as you're saying with the words you speak. We communicate in the way we touch. If you're helping somebody to transfer from one chair to another, or you're helping somebody put on an article of clothing, or you're helping somebody eat, and the action is meant to convey caring, but you're doing it roughly or too quickly, then you're communicating as much by the way you're doing it as the fact that you're doing it. We communicate with body language. Talking on a cell phone while somebody is trying to say something to you is body language. Or watching television or being distracted. That all conveys a lot. Certainly the way we behave with other people conveys a lot about how we feel. And we can't forget, of course, that we convey a lot in email and text. And it's interesting because as we move to these online ways of communicating that involve fewer and fewer words, it's very, very easy to miscommunicate important feelings. And I'm sure that you can think of other ways that you communicate on a daily basis. I'm seeing wonderful comments come up, and we will try to deal with all of them. But absolutely, I acknowledge and agree with you that protectiveness goes both ways, and I mean for it to go both ways. You'll frequently hear from a person living with MS that he or she doesn't want to worry their partner because the partner already has taken on a lot or has so many things to be worried about that the person with MS will just keep a new symptom silent, not talk about it. So yes, I absolutely agree with you, and thank you for saying it. The communication does go both ways. So effective communication isn't easy. I think it's doable, but it's not easy. And the goals of communicating are, first of all, we want to accurately convey what's on our minds. We want to convey our ideas, our feelings, and our needs, and we want to convey it in an authentic, believable way. And we want to make sure that we're getting across what we want clearly. We want to communicate in a way that respects the ideas and the feelings and the needs of the other person. Sometimes it's hard to do that because we're so busy concentrating on how we feel that we just sort of blurt it out or talk in such a way that the other person doesn't even have a chance to get their thoughts or feelings together. It's important to send clear, unambiguous messages. And we'll have some examples in a little while of what happens when that's not true. And we want to communicate in a way that invites the other person to respond. This is particularly important if you're living or working with somebody who doesn't communicate very much at all. Sometimes the tendency with a non-communicator is to just try to keep talking at them, thinking that if you talk more, eventually you'll get them to speak up. And actually sometimes the opposite is true. Non-communicators typically have a hard time getting their thoughts in order, figuring out what they want to say, getting comfortable formulating the words to respond. And sometimes for those non-communicators it seems like so much work that they just give up. And so bombarding them with language or messages can sometimes have the opposite effect of what you want it to have. And you need to allow time and space for that other person to respond. And everybody's got a different pace of responding. I'm now seeing a message that says communication to the server was lost attempting to reconnect. So I'm hoping that you guys can still hear me.
Yeah, Roz, we can still hear you.
Okay. I think that means I can't move the slides, though. Let's see what happens.
I can move them for you.
Well, let me try. I'm trying to get to slide 34.
Yep, the one right now says, try these tips for talking.
Okay, so everybody's seeing it but me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. That's coming. See, I can't see it. Okay, so it sounds obvious, but I think you really do need to make time for talking. And in a busy household, this might mean setting a time in the day that is the time for having a one-on-one conversation without a lot of distractions. It's almost like making a date. Believe me, there are a lot of couples who can go through an entire week without having a lot of conversation if they don't make time for it in their busy schedules. It means acknowledging those differences in coping and communication styles. And even more importantly, I think it means using I statements. If you start your conversations with you do this, you say that, you always, the most immediate reaction to that is a defensive one. It's putting that person's back up against the wall. So it's always a good idea to start your communications by talking about you. I feel, I wish, I would like, I sometimes think. That's much less likely to get a defensive response. And it allows the other person to respond with how he or she is feeling, what they're thinking. So try to start your statements with I. Be sure to give the other person time to think and respond. And above all, think before you speak. Sometimes when you're most upset or you feel like you have the most you want to get out, in communicating to that other person, that's exactly the same time, the right time to step back, take a deep breath, think about what you want to say. Because sometimes once those angry words are out or those accusatory words are out, you can't take them back very easily. So thinking before you speak is a good idea for all of us. It's a good idea not to overgeneralize. Anytime you start by saying you always do something or you never do something, it's very hard for a person to respond to that. Try to focus on the situation at hand. Just deal with that situation because nobody feels good when they're being accused of always or never doing the right thing. Sarcasm doesn't help in many conversations. So if you find yourself using a lot of sarcasm, that's really a signal that all those angry feelings are just bubbling out in your words. It's better to step back, think about what it really is that you want to say, and say it straight out to avoid that angry edge to your voice. Don't engage in magical thinking. No matter how much we care about each other, we cannot read each other's minds. Even the person who loves you most in the world can't read your mind. A really good example of this is somebody with MS has a lot of symptoms that are unpredictable and come and go. On a day when that person is feeling really, really good, I'll say she, in this example, she wants to do as much as she can for herself. She doesn't want people hovering over her or treating her as though she's sick or has a disability. She's feeling great that day. Wants people to back off. But then on another day, when fatigue has just hit like crazy, she might be pretty resentful when her family or her colleagues don't pitch in and help. But the problem is, because some of those symptoms are invisible, those family members or colleagues don't know. So if they get yelled at for helping too much, they're likely to back off and hesitate to step in and help on another day. So it's really important to give other people clear signals. Today is a great day. I'm doing fine. Thanks very much. I don't need any help, but I will ask you when I do need help. Thank you very much. And on a bad day, saying, today is not such a great day. I could really use some help. Don't wait for them to read your mind. And here are just a few what I call guaranteed showstoppers. Oh, no, wait a second. We're on tips for listening. Equally important as tips for talking. When you're listening, be sure to listen actively and confirm what you've heard. This is particularly important if you've experienced some memory changes and you're not sure that you're going to remember what somebody's saying. It's a good idea to listen and then stop and say, wait, let me just make sure I've got this right. This is what you said. Or if you're a care partner or a colleague or a friend of somebody else, it's important to do the same thing. You listen actively. Don't jump to conclusions. You take the time to ensure that you've understood what the person is trying to convey. Pay attention to your body language while you're listening. Again, if you're distracted by something else, not really paying attention, that's hurtful. That means that what the person is saying to you isn't interesting, doesn't matter, you don't really care. Eye rolling is a no-no. Doesn't make any of us feel good when somebody rolls their eyes while we're talking to them. Smirking, finger jabbing, pointing, any of those things convey hurtful messages while you're listening. And if somebody says something to you that hurts your feelings, or insults you, a really good, easy tip is just to say, ouch. I literally mean ouch. Everybody understands what ouch means. If somebody says something to you that's hurtful and you say ouch, it gives them a very clear signal that they've caused you discomfort. And they can either say, oh, I didn't mean that to be hurtful. I'm really sorry. Let me make sure you understand what I meant. Or they can say, oh, you're right. I'm really sorry. That was a mean thing to say. It gives them a chance to stop and think about what it is that might have hurt you. Try it. See if you like it. It works for lots of people. When you're listening, it's important not to interrupt or finish the other person's sentence. Particularly if you are working or living with somebody who has MS, whose cognitive issues have caused the problem. They're not processing information as quickly as they used to. They're not pulling their thoughts together as quickly as they used to. It can be very tempting to jump in and finish that person's sentence. That's pretty hurtful, annoying, and often you haven't finished it correctly. So it's important to just try and wait and give that person time to process their thoughts and put them into words and say what they have to say. If you're not sure what somebody means or what somebody's trying to say to you, it's polite and important to ask, because that's the only way to make sure that you're not jumping to conclusions or misinterpreting what's going on. See if we can move just one slide at a time. So here are some guaranteed showstoppers. Maybe they'll remind you of familiar circumstances. Whatever. This is a turn of phrase that we've all learned from teenagers, and unfortunately it's spreading to the general population. What does that mean when people say that? To me, it means, whatever, I don't care. Say what you want, think what you want, feel what you want. I'm done talking. I'm not even going to bother to respond. If you want to stop communication, that's a slam dunk way to do it. Another familiar scenario, I don't even know where to begin. That and variations of that phrase convey the message that things are so messed up, or you are doing so many things wrong that I can't even begin to tell you about them. It conveys that you've given up hope and that the other person isn't even worth the effort of trying to communicate with. I don't even know where to begin. This is who I am. Get used to it. This message means I'm not changing. You don't like it? It's tough. It means there's no negotiating, no problem solving, no collaboration, no conversation. Again, a very painful showstopper. Here's one I mentioned before. You always, or you never. It doesn't give the other person much room to respond, because it means they never do anything right. It's hard to come back with a response because the person feels so defensive that they don't even know how to begin having a conversation. If you really cared about me, you'd know when I need your help. And this gets back to the idea that even somebody who loves you a lot, really can't read your mind. So it's not fair to be resentful when somebody doesn't know what you want, particularly when what you want may change from day to day or even hour to hour. So I think it's important to assume that these people in your life do care about you, and therefore it's worthwhile, it's worth your time and their time for you to give an honest explanation of what you need or what you don't need on a given day. So, for those of you who are living with MS, here are some helpful tips. Remember that no one can read your mind. Be ready to put on your teaching hat. You have to be the one to explain and educate others, because those invisible symptoms are not easy for other people to understand. And even your visible symptoms or issues may not be easy to understand. Some people will learn better by asking you questions and getting your answers. Some people will find it more comfortable to read something that you give them, which is why all of our organizations have materials that you can get and offer to the people in your life. But ask them how they would most like to learn about MS, and then you can help them understand it. Try not to give mixed signals. So you're going to speak up when you need assistance and say no thank you when you don't. Having patience and a sense of humor will make it a lot easier to deal with other people's reactions. I know that's hard. You don't always have that patience, and your humor can really run thin. But humor can get you over a lot of rough spots, and sometimes it makes it easier to start those difficult conversations. And keep in mind that other people are going to take their cue from you. The more that you can talk comfortably about what's going on with you, the more they'll feel comfortable asking questions and getting information from you. And for others of you, it's important to remember that lots of us make incorrect assumptions about people with disabilities. Because we can't tell what's going on, or we may not have experienced it ourselves, we can quickly jump to conclusions about what they can or can't do. My favorite example of this is a couple goes into a restaurant, and the husband uses a wheelchair, and they come up to the table, and the husband is sitting in the wheelchair, and the wife is in her seat, and the wait staff comes over to the table and turns to the wife and says, "What would he like for dinner?" It's an assumption that because somebody uses a wheelchair, that person can't talk or think or choose food that they want. It's not a mean feeling. It's not a nasty feeling. It's just these misconceptions that people jump to. So we have to remember not to make those incorrect assumptions about somebody who has MS. It's very easy to fall into the trap of trying to compare our experiences with theirs. How many people, have said, I'm just so tired, I can't even believe it, I can't put one foot in front of the other, and have somebody who's trying to be helpful or supportive to say, we all get tired. I know what that feels like. We don't know what it feels like for that person with MS who's just overwhelmed with MS fatigue. So sometimes we're trying to be supportive by comparing it to our own feelings, but we have to remember that those symptoms, whether they're cognitive changes or fatigue or various kinds of pain, are probably very different than the ones we feel on a day-to-day basis. The best way to understand what's going on with another person is to ask. And when we ask, it's important to listen, to give that person time to educate and explain about what's going on with their body or their feelings. And the best way to know if somebody would like assistance from you is to ask. Don't assume that you can tell just by looking. So with that, those are my tips. I know we've had some questions and some comments. So
That's right, Roz. That was a great presentation, and we do have a few questions.
Great.
So I will just go ahead and get them out to you. One says, how do I avoid someone who is showing pity without insulting them?
Well, I think that depends on who that person is, but I think it's okay to say, I appreciate your concern and I appreciate your feeling, but you don't need to pity me. It doesn't make me feel comfortable. I'd rather that we found something else, something else to talk about or something else to do together. Pity sometimes it's just a misguided feeling that comes from a caring place, and that's where education can be so important. You just, I think, try to engage that person on another level by talking about other things or asking them to do something social with you.
That's great. The next question says, my husband thinks he knows all about MS, but he does not. How do I get that across to him?
It's a great question. I think it's to say that, everybody's MS is so unique. And I appreciate that you've learned a lot about MS or you've read a lot or you had somebody in your family who has it. But, my MS is my own. It's not like anybody else's. That's what's so frustrating about this disease. So I'd really like to be able to tell you about mine.
That's great. The next question says, one thing that is frustrating as a support partner is having to repeat myself often. What can I do to avoid frustrating myself and my MSer?
It's a wonderful question, and I actually hear it a lot. It is frustrating to have to repeat it. So here's some quick tips for talking to somebody who has some memory issues. One is to make sure when you're communicating that you're doing it in a non-distracting environment. If you've got multiple conversations going on, a TV blaring, the phone is ringing, the kids are talking or demanding attention, a person who has attention and memory problems is not going to be able to track the conversation and remember it later. So try to have those important conversations in a distraction-free environment. Make eye contact. Take the time for your partner to catch up with you. So to listen, to try and repeat back what she's heard you say, because that hearing it, repeating it, confirming it helps to solidify those memories so that she will be able to hold on to them. Writing down important things in a consistent place, a notepad. A family calendar is particularly helpful so that you don't have to keep repeating things that could be posted easily on a calendar. Anything like that that helps reinforce something that you've said. And some of those memory problems will respond very well to that. It's not going to take the problem away completely. And I think it's okay to say, sometimes I just find this hard. I miss the days when I could just say something and you remember it. And my guess is that your partner will feel exactly the same way. I miss those days too. And then that's something that you grieve over together. But those tips, I think, will help a lot to reduce some of the repetition.
That's great. And we just had one of the participants comment on what you said, and she said, my spouse tells me important things he wants me to remember in the morning because he knows that that's my best time cognitively.
That's a great idea. And probably the spouse knows that because they've actually talked about it. So that's another good strategy. Figure out when to make those times to talk or when are the best times of day, because it might be morning for one person and another time for somebody else. So that's a wonderful problem-solving strategy.
All right. The next question asks, My spouse and I are both retired. He is so good about helping me with things that are difficult for me to do, but emotionally he is detached and seems apathetic. It hurts, and I'm not sure how to act.
When somebody's detached and apathetic, it's really hard to know what's going on. Sometimes people become detached or seem apathetic because they're worn out. Sometimes they feel a loss of the way things used to be, and underneath it all they're just quite sad. And so detaching themselves is a way to relieve that sadness. Sometimes people are depressed. Depression can take all different kinds of forms, and detachment, apathy, disconnection can be a sign of depression. So it's hard to know what's going on, but I agree that it's very uncomfortable and painful. And so, I think it's important to try and have a conversation to find out what's behind it. And sometimes, it's hard to jumpstart that kind of conversation, and sitting down with a family counselor or one of the healthcare professionals can be a way to start that conversation.
That's helpful. We have time for one last question before we wrap up.
These are great questions, everybody. Thank you.
They are. And this one says, sometimes the person with MS just can't do something like go for a hike that's important to the other person. How do you talk about that? Another great question. Okay. I think it's important to talk about the changes and the losses. That's a situation where both people are feeling an intense loss. And grieving over that is healthy, it's important, and it's something that you can grieve together. But in addition to that, I think it's really important to problem solve about how you're going to deal with that. And different couples come up with different solutions. For some couples, they decide it's very important for the spouse to continue hiking because hiking is healthy and something that person loves to do. And so they find times for the person without MS to go do that activity, but they make sure that they schedule other activities that they can do together so that they're not giving up together time. I think it's also important to look at the ways that mobility devices can make it possible for people to do some things that they thought they had to stop doing together because mobility issues got in the way. So one of the things I'd love to see is for couples who aren't doing those long walks or hikes together anymore to start doing them again because the person with MS finds a scooter that can go on rough terrain or a scooter that can go on city streets, and they get to have those times together again that allow for conversation and being out of doors and getting exercise, but it's being willing to do it differently so that they can do it together, and mobility devices can be a wonderful way for that to happen. I think the danger is when a person who loves to hike and is still able to hike or play tennis or whatever it is gives it up because they feel so guilty that their partner can't do it, and then they feel resentful and grief-stricken, and those feelings build up. So I think whatever the couple decides is the best way to handle it, the important thing is that they're getting it out in the open and problem-solving together about finding ways to have recreation together when possible and separately when that's important too. Well, that's great. What great questions and a great presentation. Roz, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I just think that we all think that communication should be easy, that, we spend our lives learning how to do it. I think it's actually one of the most challenging activities for people in close relationships. And I'm so glad that you came on this program. to talk about it and to share your questions and your ideas. And this is the kind of thing that when people come to Can-Do MS programs, particularly the 5-day programs where you have that long, intense time to practice this kind of communication and learn skills as you're learning other things about MS, it's a great experience. So I hope to get to meet all of you one of these days.
All right. Thank you so much. And a big thanks to all the participants who joined us for this webinar. We had a great turnout and great questions, and we're excited about the upcoming webinars. I just want to thank Novartis Pharmaceutical Companies again for sponsoring this program. The next webinar is scheduled for January 11th, 2011 at the same time, 8 p.m. Eastern. The topic is Get Back on Track, Keep Your Motivation Alive. And the presenter is David Engstrom, Can-Do MS Program Consultant. And beginning with the January webinar, the webinar format will be a little bit different. Based on the feedback from participants like you will now be able to listen to the webinar through your computer speakers rather than calling in to hear the webinar. The registration process will be the same, and you can register for the upcoming 2011 webinars at www.mscando.org. And for those participating live tonight, as soon as the presentation is over, you will see a survey appear on your screen. Please take a moment to complete the survey and help us continue to improve this webinar series. And we value your feedback and input. Thanks again, and have a great night.
Thank you. Please stand by.